So in this video, we're going to look at factoring with four terms. So essentially, we're going to be looking at factoring something that looks like this. X to the third minus x squared plus 9x minus 9. So this is a little bit different than some of the factoring we've looked at in the past because once again, there are four terms. So let's first establish a set of rules and then we'll go from there. So the first rule is we're going to use a method called grouping. So grouping looks like this. You essentially group your first two terms, so first two terms, and you also group your second two terms. All right, so there's four terms total. We group the first two and the last two. All right, so now the second step is we're going to factor out a GCF. So factor GCF from each group. All right, so each from each group. All right, now step 3, I'll have to show you, but essentially we're going to take out the common binomial, which essentially I'll just say it this way, the common parentheses. And then whatever's left over is our other factor. So I'll have to show you step 3 because when I say it, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. When I write it out and you see how it's done, it does make a lot of sense. So let's go back to our example, and we'll actually work a few of these. So x to the third minus x squared plus 9x minus 9. So when we say the first step is to group, once again, this can be simply done by just putting parentheses around the first two terms and the last two terms. All right, so we're going to group these together. And actually, I'd probably do it like this. I'd probably leave the plus sign out of this. All right, so we're going to then take a GCF out of each group, which just means each parentheses. I can't really talk. So x squared, or x to the third, minus x squared. What's the biggest, or what is the GCF I could take out of this? Well, both terms have an x, so I know if two terms or any terms, if all the terms have an x, I can take out the lowest exponent. So I can actually factor out an x to the third, which is going to leave me with x minus 1. Because when I divide x squared by itself, it just gives me 1. So that's my first GCF step. The second GCF step is going to be the second group, which is 9x minus 9, and we can factor a 9 out of that. And it would leave me with x minus 1. Now, what I didn't mention when we did the steps is for this third step, we want to have parentheses that are the same. All right, so you'll notice that these two parentheses are the exact same. That's that common binomial I was talking about at the beginning. Basically, when these two parentheses are the same, that gives you one of your factors. So one of your factors here is x minus 1. Now, if we get rid of that, because we just took that part out, everything that's left over actually gives us our second factor. So x plus 9, or x squared plus 9 gives us our second factor. So we would have this factored once we get our second factor, and it would be x minus 1 times x squared plus 9. So once again, let's do another problem, and I would suggest you try to do this. So k to the third plus k squared, actually 5k squared, minus k minus 5. So once again, let's go through our steps. Our steps are to first group, which we can do by just putting parentheses around the first two terms and the last two terms. Now, you'll notice I did something here, which is include this negative in my parentheses. When you do that, just make sure when you rewrite this or when you're factoring out your GCF, put a plus sign out here, or just know that what we're really doing in between these two is adding. All right, so I would just make sure I know that I'm adding in between. So the first thing we're going to do is group out of the first parentheses. So, or not group, GCF out of the first parentheses. I'm losing my mind. All right, so that means we're going to factor out the biggest essentially the biggest thing we can divide out, which would be k squared. So k squared, that's going to leave me with k plus 5 on the inside. Then remember, we have this plus sign out here. Even though we included this minus in the parentheses, we're going to act like this plus sign's out here. All right, so now what could we factor out of negative k minus 5? But here's what I would suggest you do. Look at this first parentheses, because remember, we want our two parentheses for this third step to be the same. So if we want our parentheses to be the same, that means that we need to make negative k minus 5 become k plus 5. So we could actually factor out a negative 1 here, and it would change this to k plus 5. So now, our two parentheses that are the same, that's our first factor. So k plus 5 is our first factor. Everything that's on the outside is our second factor. Now, we have k squared plus a negative 1, and plus a negative 1 is just minus 1. All right, so now those would be our factors. So that's part of the answer, but actually let's take a look at that for a minute. You may be asked to factor this completely, which means we would still need to factor this k squared minus 1, and that could be done with difference of squares. So this would become k plus 5, k minus 1, k plus 1. That would actually be our full answer. Now, it's all depending on what type of question you're being asked. Sometimes maybe this could be the answer or get you as far as you need to go. Sometimes this would be the full answer. So it all just depends, but that'll be part of what you and your teacher can figure out together. All right, how about let's do one more, and then that'll be it for this video. We'll try to keep it short and sweet. So let's say we have 4, I'll just change this to x to the third minus 5x to the second minus 16x plus 20. So once again, our job is to factor this by grouping. So we're going to group to begin the problem. Once again, I would try this on your own. Group the first two terms, the last two terms. Remember, if you include this negative, make sure you know that it's a plus sign down here for the second step. So now we're going to factor a GCF out of each term or each parentheses. So the first parentheses, the biggest thing we could factor out is only x squared. So that would leave us with 4x minus 5. Then we could factor out of this second parentheses. Once again, keep in mind that we want this second parentheses to become this parentheses, which is 4x minus 5. So 16 and 20, I know I could factor out a 4. So I want to factor out that 4, but then this is negative x and plus 20. We want this to become positive x minus 5. So I would factor out a negative 4 here. So then we have 4x minus 5. Now our parentheses are the same. So once again, the parentheses that are the same, that is one of your factors. The parentheses, well, everything outside of the parentheses is your second factor. So x squared minus 4 is our second factor. Now, once again, this could actually be broken down further with difference of squares. I would communicate with your teacher and just see how exactly they would like you to break this down, but most of the time you see it broken down like this. So these would be the factors for this problem. So once again, grouping is a method used for 4-term factoring, and grouping works like this. The first step is you group your first two terms, so first two terms and second terms, or second two terms. All right. Then we take a GCF out of both groups. So GCF out of both. And then the last thing we do is we want to make sure that our parentheses are the same. And then everything else, so everything else is our second factor. All right. So once again, these are good examples to practice. If you can do these examples, you're pretty good on this. As always, if this video helped you, it would be much appreciated if you would like and subscribe and all that. And that'll be it for this video.